Cool dawn air rests against your skin as pale dust softens the floor of the Bisti Badlands. In this quiet corner of northwestern New Mexico, the ground is dry, open, and faintly silver with morning light. A shallow wash leads forward between low clay walls, where the silence is broken only by a thin breath of wind. Near the ground, tiny grains begin to move, tapping softly against mudstone, siltstone, and sandstone. The land appears still at first, but its surfaces carry the marks of patient motion. Here, wind does not carve quickly or loudly. It works close to the earth, lifting dust and polishing exposed stone grain by grain. Hard caps shelter softer layers beneath them, while nearby hollows are swept clean and slowly deepened. Each hoodoo, ribbed slope, and rounded mound holds part of an older story written in ancient coastal plains, ash falls, and buried river mud. As the light spreads across the basin, the shapes begin to show how stillness and change can exist together. And if you follow the morning breeze through the wash, the first quiet traces of wind carving begin to appear. The wash bends gently to the right, and the choice is quiet but clear. You can climb the low ridge beside it, where the morning light touches the tops of pale mounds, or you can stay low, where the wind is already gathering itself. The ridge would give a wider view, but the wash holds the first evidence, so you follow the wind at ground level, letting the shallow corridor guide you deeper into the basin. Almost at once the surface changes beneath your steps. A thin layer of loose dust lies in sheltered pockets, but the open floor is swept cleaner, firmer, and faintly polished. That difference matters because it shows where the air has been moving with enough force to lift the smallest grains away. The wind does not need to be strong to begin its work. It only needs an open surface, dry sediment, and time. Ahead, the wash narrows between two low banks of clay, each one no taller than a seated person. Their faces are not smooth walls, but soft fluted surfaces, with fine vertical ribs running downward like melted wax. Those ribs began with water, with brief desert rain gathering into threads and drawing loose material down the slope. But after the water left, the wind returned, and it cleared the loosened grains from the little grooves. This is how the Badlands often change, not by one force alone, but by a quiet sequence. Rain loosens, gravity shifts, sun dries. Then wind removes. The result is a surface that looks delicate, almost unfinished, as if the land has been brushed with a very fine tool. The Bisti Badlands sit within the larger San Juan Basin, a broad geologic bowl that stretches through northwestern New Mexico and nearby parts of the Four Corners region. Here, the air is often dry, and the vegetation is sparse enough that stone and sediment meet the sky directly. That openness gives the wind room to work. There are no thick forests to soften it, no deep mat of roots to hold every grain in place. Instead, small shrubs grow far apart, and low plants cling where water gathers briefly after rain. Between them, exposed clay and sand lie waiting. The morning breeze threads through these open spaces, following the easiest path. It slides over the wash floor, touches the bank, then curls behind a rounded mound. There, in the lee of the mound, a small crescent of dust has gathered overnight. On the windward side, the surface is smoother and cleaner. That simple contrast becomes the first readable sign in the landscape. One side gives grains away, the other receives them. A few steps farther on, the wash opens into a small basin no wider than a room. The floor is pale grey, with a faint lavender tint where the clay is damp from yesterday's cool night air. In the center, a low sandstone cap rests on softer material beneath it. The cap is only a little thicker than a book, but it has changed everything below it. Where it covers the clay, the ground is sheltered. Where it does not, the clay has lowered, grain by grain, until the cap now stands slightly proud above its surroundings. This is the beginning of a small pedestal. It is not yet a hoodoo, not fully, but the pattern is already there. A harder stone protects a softer column, while exposed surfaces around it are slowly carried away. You pause near the little cap, because it gives the story a fixed point. The basin is wide, and the shapes are many, but this one stone can be followed. It can become a marker for the day. The decision settles gently. Instead of wandering from shape to shape, you will keep returning to this capped mound and watch how the corridor around it explains the larger Badlands. The wind crosses it from the northwest, low and steady. Fine grains tap against its base, too softly to hear unless everything else is still. Over years, those grains act like a patient file. They do not cut deeply in a single morning. They touch, rebound, settle, rise again, and touch once more. The effect is strongest close to the ground, where wind-blown sand moves in little hops. Above the cap, the air feels empty. At ankle height, it carries the landscape itself. The first sunlight reaches the far edge of the basin, and the colors begin to separate. What seemed grey becomes many greys. Some slopes are pearl-colored, some are ash blue, some carry pale yellow bands or rusty seams where minerals have stained the sediment. A broken line of darker material runs along one bank, thin and uneven, like a shadow trapped inside the earth. That darker layer hints at older swampy ground, where plant matter once collected in a very different world. The present desert is quiet and open, but its materials were not born in this dryness. They were laid down in low, wet places, near rivers, floodplains, coastal swamps, and shifting channels. The wind is carving an archive that began far from the feeling of this morning. That is one reason the forms here seem so strange. They are desert shapes made from sediments that remember water. The wash carries you toward a wider corridor, where the ground dips and rises in shallow waves. Each dip holds slightly finer dust. Each rise shows more exposed stone. This rhythm is not accidental. Wind removes loose grains most easily from high exposed surfaces, then leaves them in calmer pockets. Over time, those tiny differences grow. A shallow hollow becomes a deeper hollow because it catches loosened material and allows the next breeze to clear it again. A firm patch remains a ridge because it resists removal just a little longer. The landscape sorts itself by texture, hardness, and airflow. Nothing announces the change. It simply accumulates. Now the basin feels more awake, though nothing is hurried. A raven passes high overhead, silent at this distance, then slips beyond a clay ridge. Below it, there is almost no movement except dust. The plants are small and widely spaced, mostly low shrubs and grasses that seem to keep their own quiet distance. Their roots help hold small islands of soil together. Around those islands, bare sediment lies open to the wind. This creates a patchwork surface. Some grains are anchored, some are free. Where roots hold the surface, the ground stands slightly higher. Where bare clay is exposed, the wind and runoff lower it. Even the plants, sparse as they are, shape the flow of air. A shrub breaks the breeze, and dust settles behind it in a soft tail. Another bare patch remains swept and pale, polished by the passing grains. The wash bends again, and the capped mound disappears behind a low bank. For a moment you lose sight of the marker. This small absence changes the way the place feels. Without the capstone as a point of return, the basin becomes a maze of similar tones. Mounds repeat, ribs repeat. Small gullies branch into other gullies, each one seeming to offer a path. The land does not resist you, but it does not simplify itself either. So you stop and look for the wind's direction. A line of dust moves along the floor, barely rising above the ground. It slides through the right-hand opening, then vanishes around a soft shoulder of clay. That is enough. You follow the moving dust. The corridor narrows, and the air becomes slightly cooler in the shade. Here, the clay wall has been undercut at its base. The upper portion leans out by only a few inches, but the shape is clear. Near the ground, the wall has retreated more than it has above. This undercut form reveals a practical truth about wind carving. Wind is not equally strong everywhere on a cliff face. The grains it carries stay mostly low, bouncing and skimming near the surface. They strike the lower rock more often than the upper rock, so the base is sanded, softened, and hollowed first. If the top is stronger, it remains. If the base is weaker, it narrows. In time, a ledge forms. In longer time, a column may emerge. And in still longer time, the top may lose the support it once had. The idea is simple, but the evidence is everywhere now. A small alcove curves into the bank like a shallow breath. Its back wall is smooth, and its floor is swept clean. Loose flakes rest only along the quietest edge, where the wind slows. The alcove is not large, but it shows an active edge in the story. Material has been removed from this exact place. The curve did not appear all at once. It widened because every passing gust found the same weakness and returned to it. The Badlands are not carved evenly, they are edited. The softer words are taken away first, and the harder ones remain longer on the page. Beyond the alcove, the corridor opens back into sunlight. The capped mound comes into view again, now seen from the side. From this angle, it looks more fragile. The little stone slab casts a narrow shadow on the clay beneath it, and that shadow makes the column easier to read. The protected core is slightly higher than the surrounding floor. At its base, a faint groove circles part of the mound, where grains have struck and rebounded. The groove is small, almost hidden, but it marks the place where the next change will concentrate. Because once a notch begins, it can gather force. Air curls into it. Sand touches it more often. Rainwater collects there briefly and loosens more clay. Then the wind removes what the water has prepared. Cause and effect become visible at the scale of a handspan. The wider San Juan Basin surrounds this moment with stillness. To the east and north, distant mesas hold the horizon in low, muted lines. Between them, the Bisti Badlands wilderness spreads as a broken plain of washes, mounds, hoodoos, and bare slopes. The land has little surface water most of the year. When rain comes, it can run quickly over the clay, because the fine sediment does not absorb water like loose sand. Thin sheets of runoff gather into rills. Rills join into washes, then the water leaves, often as quickly as it arrived. Afterward, the ground dries, cracks, and flakes. That is when wind can pick up the loosened pieces, especially the smallest grains. Wind carving here is not separate from water erosion. It often follows it like a quiet second hand. Morning grows warmer, and the dust begins to lift a little higher. Not much, just enough to soften the view near the ground. You can see the movement best where sunlight crosses the wash at a low angle. Tiny grains flash briefly, then vanish. They are not carried in a thick cloud. They move as individual points, hopping, sliding, and creeping over the surface. The heaviest grains barely rise. They nudge other grains forward. The lighter dust can lift and travel farther, sometimes leaving the basin entirely. This sorting changes the texture of the land. Where fine dust is removed, the surface may become slightly coarser. Where coarser fragments remain, they can form a thin protective skin. Even a surface made of small stones can slow erosion because it shields the finer material underneath. But here, many surfaces remain exposed and soft, so the wind keeps finding openings. The route now leads past a cluster of low domes. Their tops are rounded and pale, with faint cracks like the skin of drying clay. Some cracks are fresh and sharp, others are softened by dust. The domes reveal another stage of the same process. A mound may begin as a slightly firmer mass within softer sediment. Rain cuts around it, wind clears the loosened grains, the top rounds under weathering, while the sides are trimmed and polished. If a harder cap appears, the mound may become a pedestal. If no cap protects it, the mound lowers more evenly, losing height until it blends back into the plain. Every form here holds a different balance between shelter and exposure. The capped mound behind you is one balance, the low domes are another. The fluted walls, the undercut alcoves, and the swept hollows are others. Together they make the basin feel like a slow conversation between stone and air. You continue down the wash because the wind continues down the wash. This is the simplest rule for the morning. Where the corridor tightens, the breeze feels slightly more focused. Where the wash widens, it spreads and weakens. That change affects where grains strike and where they fall. At the mouth of a narrow passage, a small fan of sand has gathered. It lies against the leeward side of a clay knob, shaped like a soft wedge. The fan shows that the wind slowed here just enough to drop part of its load. A few feet away, a polished patch shows where it accelerated again. The evidence is modest but precise. The land is recording air movement in sediment. You step around the fan rather than through it, because even a footprint would change the small pattern. In a place like this, scale matters. A boot track can last longer than expected on a dry surface. A disturbed crust can expose loose grains to the next breeze. The Badlands look broad and durable from a distance, yet many surfaces are delicate when seen closely. This fragility is part of their beauty. It reminds you that wind carving depends on access. If the surface is covered, rooted or crusted, the wind is slowed. If the surface is bare, dry, and loose, the wind can begin again. The basin gives the wind many such places. That is why its shapes keep changing, quietly and continuously. The wash floor becomes slightly firmer as it crosses a band of harder sandstone. The color warms from pale gray to tan. A shallow step appears where the harder layer resists lowering. Water once ran over this step during a storm, smoothing its edge. On its downstream side, a little apron of sand has collected, pale and thin, as if the wash had exhaled there and left part of itself behind. The step is small, but it marks a boundary between materials, and boundaries are where the Bisti Badlands begin to explain themselves. Above the harder sandstone, the wash floor holds its shape a little longer. Below it, the softer clay gives way more easily, lowering into a shallow trough. The wind notices that difference, even if it has no intention. It follows the lowered path, gathers grains from the trough, and sends them moving along the corridor. This is how a small change in hardness becomes a larger change in shape. The land does not need a cliff or canyon to show its structure. A step only a few inches high can reveal that one layer is resisting, while another is slowly being carried away. You pause at the edge of the step and look back toward the capped mound. From here, the capstone is partly hidden by the curve of the wash, but its shadow still appears as a dark, narrow line. It seems separate from this sandstone step at first, but both belong to the same idea. Harder pieces remain longer. Softer pieces retreat around them. The wind does not invent the pattern, it brings the buried pattern into view. As the morning continues, the corridor grows brighter and the colors sharpen along the low walls. A cream band lies above a gray band. A yellowish lens of sandstone cuts across a slope. A dark seam appears, disappears, and then returns farther along the wash, uneven and thin. These layers were not placed here by the desert you see now. They came from an older world, long before this dry basin opened to the sky. The Bisti Badlands are part of the San Juan Basin, but the sediments inside them were shaped when this region lay near low coastal plains. Rivers wandered across flat ground, swamps held standing water, floods spread mud in sheets, sand settled in channels. Plant matter collected in quiet, wet places, later becoming thin seams of coal. Volcanic ash drifted from distant eruptions and fell as pale, powdery layers. Over time, these deposits stacked one over another, not evenly but in patches, lenses, and beds. That unevenness matters now, because when erosion finally exposed them, each layer answered the wind differently. Some held together, some crumbled, some broke into flakes, some released grains so fine they could rise in the lightest breeze. You move forward again, following the shallow wash as it cuts through those old layers. The present path is dry, but its walls remember water in the way they lean and curve. A sandy lens appears in one bank, slightly rougher than the clay around it. It forms a low shelf, because the grains inside it are larger and more tightly packed. Above and below that shelf, the mudstone has weathered into gentler slopes. This is differential erosion in its quietest form. Different materials lose themselves at different speeds. The harder or better cemented layer stands out, while the weaker layer pulls back. There is no single surface here. There is only a stack of responses. The wind tests each one, rain tests each one, heat, frost, salt, and gravity test each one. And after enough time, the strongest outlines become visible as ledges, caps, ribs, and knobs. The sandstone shelf continues for several yards, then thins and ends abruptly. Its end is rounded and polished, as if the layer has been rubbed smooth by many passing grains. Just beyond it, the bank softens into pale clay again. The wall there is lower, more easily worn, and broken into small scallops. Those scallops show where water first cut tiny paths downward, but their lower edges are clean with almost no loose debris. The wind has been here after the water. It has cleared the floor and trimmed the openings. You can see how one process hands work to another. A rare rain makes a wound. Drying widens a crack. A breeze removes the loose grains. Then the next rain finds a slightly deeper path. Nothing is hurried, but everything is connected. The wash turns left, and the land opens into a broader hollow. Here, the floor is covered with fine, pale dust, except where narrow wind streaks have swept it bare. The streaks point in the same direction as the morning breeze. They cross the hollow like faint brush marks. A few small pebbles sit at the heads of tiny tails of dust. Each pebble has sheltered the ground behind it. On its upwind side, the surface is cleaner. On its downwind side, a little ridge of protected sediment remains. The pattern is so small it could fit under your hand, yet it is the same pattern that shapes hoodoos and mesas. Shelter allows one patch to remain. Exposure lowers the patch beside it. Scale changes, but the rule stays gentle and steady. You kneel close to one of the pebble tails, careful not to touch it. The sheltered dust tapers into a narrow point. Its shape records the direction of air during the last few hours, maybe the last few days. If the wind changes direction tonight, the tail may blur or shift. If rain comes, it may vanish. But for now, it is a tiny weather vane made of sediment. The Bisti landscape is full of such brief records. Some last moments, some last seasons, some last thousands of years. The difference depends on what is protected, what is exposed, and how deeply the mark has entered the land. The old layers beneath your feet carry records on a much longer scale. During the late Cretaceous period, this region lay near the edge of a broad inland sea that once divided much of North America. The shoreline did not stay fixed. It shifted back and forth over time, leaving coastal plains, river channels, swamps and flood basins in its wake. When the sea lay closer, fine mud could settle in quiet water. When rivers pushed across the plain, sand filled their channels. When swamps spread, plant material gathered in low, wet places. When volcanic ash fell from distant eruptions, it laid down soft, pale sheets that would later weather easily. These deposits became parts of the Fruitland and Kirtland formations, names geologists use for the layered rock units exposed across this region. The names are useful, but the land itself tells the story more softly. A sandstone ledge means moving water once carried sand. A dark seam means plant matter once collected and was buried. A clay slope means fine mud settled and compacted over time. A pale ashy layer means dust from fire mountains drifted through the ancient air and settled into the plain. Now those ancient deposits stand under a dry New Mexico sky. They are no longer swamp, floodplain, or channel. They are material for wind. The contrast is part of what makes Bisti feel otherworldly. You are walking through a desert made from the memory of water. The morning breeze crosses your ankles and moves into the hollow. A few grains travel with it, hopping low, then pausing in the lee of small ridges. They do not move like smoke. They move like seeds without stems, touching down again and again. This hopping motion is called saltation. It is one of the main ways wind moves sand across open ground. A grain lifts briefly, follows a small arc, then strikes the surface. When it lands, it may bounce again, or it may knock another grain forward. Heavier grains may not lift at all. They roll or creep along the surface, nudged by the impact of moving sand. Finer dust can rise higher and remain suspended longer. That dust may travel far from the place where it began. Together, these motions sort the ground by size and weight. The wind carries the lightest material away. It pushes and hops the middle grains. It leaves the heavier fragments behind, at least for a while. When enough fine material is removed from a surface, the process is called deflation. The land lowers not because it is cut by a blade, but because loose particles are lifted away. Deflation can deepen hollows and expose harder layers beneath them. It can also leave behind a thin surface of pebbles or coarser fragments, sometimes called desert pavement. In the Bisti Badlands, not every surface becomes armored this way. Some are too soft, some are too newly exposed. Some are broken again by rain before a protective cover can form. But where coarser fragments remain, they slow the wind's access to finer grains below. A protective skin forms, nearby bare clay, without that skin, continues to lower. The difference between those two surfaces can grow year by year. You cross the hollow slowly, watching for the place where dust thins and the firmer floor reappears. At the far edge, the wash cuts into a bank of pale mudstone. The bank is crumbly at the base, and smoother above. A small overhang casts a blue shade beneath it. The shade is shallow, but it draws your attention because it shows the wind's height. Sand grains moving in saltation strike most often within the lowest part of the wall. They abrade the base, rubbing against it with each gust. The upper wall receives fewer impacts, especially when it is protected by a harder layer, so the lower material wears back first. The wall becomes undercut. A ledge forms. Sometimes that ledge fails and drops small flakes to the floor. Sometimes the ledge remains, becoming a cap above a soft recess. In this bank, the overhang is only a few inches deep, but it is the same process that will later make a hoodoo seem to balance. The wind does not need drama, it only needs repetition. You look closely at the back of the shaded recess. Its surface is smoother than the broken clay outside it. Tiny sand impacts have polished the mudstone, softening its texture. Where a thin seam crosses the recess, the polish changes. The seam resists a little more, forming a faint raised line. Below it, the clay has retreated slightly. This is the layered archive becoming sculpture. Each ancient bed has its own strength. Each one changes the path of erosion. The wind follows weakness, but it also reveals strength by leaving it behind. The wash now climbs slightly over another firmer band. The rise is gentle, but your pace changes. You move from powdery dust to a surface with small embedded grains. The sandstone feels more stable underfoot, not because it is unbreakable, but because it is more tightly held. Its grains are cemented by minerals that filled the spaces between them after burial. That cement may be silica, calcite, iron oxide, or other minerals, depending on the water chemistry that moved through the sediment long ago. Some cement makes sandstone hard and resistant. Some makes it only slightly stronger than the mudstone beside it. At Bisti, these differences can be subtle. A layer may resist just enough to form a cap. Another may weaken quickly once exposed. The result is a landscape where small variations decide the fate of large shapes. A sandstone cap does not have to be thick to matter. It only has to last longer than the clay below it. The wash levels out again, and you can see a larger cap rock ahead. It rests on a pale slope, wider than the first marker, but built from the same principle. The cap has a flat upper surface and an uneven lower edge. Its color is warmer than the clay beneath, tan with a faint orange stain. Under it, the softer material has retreated into a shallow alcove. The cap projects like a small roof. This is a clearer version of the earlier pattern. The overhanging cap protects the clay directly below from rainfall and some vertical weathering, but the open sides remain exposed to wind-blown sand. The base is carved sideways. The protected center stays taller. Over time, this combination can create a pedestal. If the pedestal narrows, a hoodoo begins. If the cap falls, the column loses its shelter and lowers more quickly. This is not a single moment, but a sequence. Protection becomes form. Form becomes imbalance. Imbalance becomes release. You do not see the release yet. You see the quiet preparation for it. The breeze passes beneath the cap's edge and curls into the alcove. Loose dust has collected at the back, where the air slows. The floor near the front is cleaner, swept by passing grains. A few thin flakes lie below the wall, fresh enough that their broken edges are lighter than their weathered faces. They likely fell after a small crack widened in the clay. Maybe drying caused the crack. Maybe a cool night helped it open. Maybe a brief shower loosened the surface. The wind has already begun removing the smallest pieces. It leaves the larger flakes for now. Later, they will split, crumble, and join the moving dust. Nothing is wasted here. Every fragment becomes part of the next surface. The ancient layers continue to show themselves as the wash bends around the cap. On the outer bend, the bank is cut more steeply. On the inner bend, sediment has settled in a low bar. Even dry washes keep the memory of flowing water in their shapes. When water moves through a bend, it runs faster along the outside and slower along the inside. The fast side cuts, the slow side deposits. Later, when the wash is dry, wind enters the same curve and edits what the water left behind. It may lift the finer sediment from the inner bar. It may polish the outer bank. It may pile dust behind a projecting knob. The wash becomes a shared pathway. Water uses it briefly. Wind uses it often. Gravity uses it constantly. Sunlight uses it by drying, heating, and cracking the surface. You follow the curve because it brings you back toward the recurring capped mound. Now the marker appears ahead, small but distinct. The sun has risen enough to shorten its shadow. The cap no longer looks like a dark line. It looks like a warm stone sitting on pale clay. Around its base, the circular groove is easier to see. The groove is not deep, but it is continuous on the windward side. It fades on the lee side, where dust has collected. This difference gives the mound a front and back. The front faces the moving grains. The back holds what the wind drops. The mound is no longer just a shape. It is an instrument measuring airflow. You approach from the downwind side first. Here, a small pocket of dust lies against the base, soft and undisturbed. It is slightly darker than the swept surface nearby, perhaps because it holds finer particles. The pocket is gathered where the wind slowed after passing around the mound. A little eddy formed there. Within that small calm, grains settled. On the opposite side, the clay is exposed and firmer. Sand impacts have polished it, and the base is notched more clearly. This contrast tells the day's story so far. The wind has not simply passed by. It has sorted, removed, stored and shaped. The capstone itself shows quieter changes. Its upper surface is faintly pitted. Small mineral grains stand out in relief where softer material around them has weathered away. The underside is smoother, protected from direct rain but touched by air that curls beneath the edge. The cap's rim is irregular. At one corner, a small projection shades the clay below. At another, the cap has weathered back, leaving the base more exposed. Even within one stone, protection is uneven. That unevenness will guide the next stage. A hoodoo is not a perfect pillar made by a simple rule. It is a negotiation between shape, hardness, cracks, wind direction, runoff, and time. The mound stands because the cap slows erosion. The mound narrows because exposure continues around the sides. Both facts are true at once. That is why the form carries tension without needing any sudden event. You can see where the narrowest part may one day become important. Just below the cap, a slight inward curve circles the clay. It is not dramatic. It is only a thinning, a soft neck beginning under the protective stone. The cap keeps rain from striking directly down on the central column. But wind-driven grains arrive from the side. They skim the floor, strike the lower clay, and wear it inward. Water from rare storms can also flow around the base, briefly loosening the same area. When the surface dries, wind returns to clear what water loosened. The notch becomes a guide for future erosion. Once a form has a neck, the air can move differently around it. It can accelerate through the narrowed space. It can curl behind it. It can focus abrasion along the lower edge. In that way, the shape begins to influence the force that is shaping it. The landscape and the wind answer one another. A little farther beyond the mound, the wash branches. One branch continues straight across a low, open floor. The other bends right into a narrower passage between pale ridges. The breeze favors the right-hand branch. You can see this by watching the dust. In the straight branch, the surface is still. In the right branch, fine grains flicker and slide along the bottom. So you follow the active path. This choice matters, because the wind's present route is the thread tying the day together. It leads from evidence to evidence, not randomly, but through the shape of the basin itself. The passage narrows, and the walls rise to waist height. Their surfaces are banded, with thin, resistant lines crossing softer slopes. Some bands project as small ribs, others crumble into shallow grooves. The ribs make the wall look like a weathered book, its pages slightly uneven. In the lower part of the passage, sand has abraded the clay into a smooth, concave curve. Higher up, the surface remains rougher, with small flakes still attached. This difference shows how strongly windwork concentrates near the ground. Although air fills the whole passage, the sand load does not. The moving grains stay low. They are heavy enough that gravity keeps returning them to the surface. Each bounce is brief, each impact is small. But the lower wall receives countless impacts compared with the upper wall. Over long periods, that difference becomes shape. The passage floor is not evenly dusty. Here and there, small stones and harder fragments form loose patches. Behind each patch, fine sediment has collected. Between patches, The wind has swept the floor bare. This creates a mottled pattern of protection and exposure. If the coarser patches remain, they may develop into a thin armor. If a storm rearranges them, the fine material below may be exposed again. Desert surfaces are not fixed, even when they look crusted and still. They are balanced between disturbance and protection. At Bisti, where soft bedrock lies near the surface, that balance changes quickly in geological terms. A single season of rain, drying, wind, and frost can alter small features. A century can shift the outline of a hoodoo. Many centuries can turn a cluster of forms into a field of stumps, slopes, and dust. The passage opens into a basin filled with low, rounded mounds. They sit apart from one another, separated by narrow channels. Some have tiny caps. Some are bare. Some are cracked along their crowns. The cracks dark with shadow. The capped ones stand higher. The uncapped ones are smoother and lower, because they are weathering more evenly. This is a natural comparison laid out in one place. The same ancient materials, exposed under similar conditions, have taken different paths because of small differences in hardness. A tiny cap, no wider than your hand, can keep a mound standing while the bare one beside it lowers into a soft dome. That small difference feels almost accidental, but it becomes the beginning of a long, visible separation. The capped mound keeps its height because the stone above it interrupts falling rain and slows the loss of clay below. The uncapped mound receives weather from every direction, and its whole surface answers at once. Its crown cracks in the sun, its sides shed thin flakes, and its base is trimmed by wind moving through the basin. Nothing about this is hurried, but the results are already clear in the morning light. One form has been given a roof, one form has not. The roof changes the future. You move between the mounds slowly, letting their differences arrange themselves in your mind. The capped forms look like early hoodoos, still short and thick, with columns not yet narrowed enough to seem delicate. The bare mounds feel older in another way, not because they began earlier, but because they are already returning to the general level of the basin. Their surfaces are smoother, with fewer sharp edges, and the wind passes over them without finding many places to catch. A cap creates shadow, and shadow protects. A crack creates weakness, and weakness invites removal. A slope creates flow, and flow carries loosened grains downward. The basin is full of these small instructions, written into the shapes themselves. Near the center of the mound field, a narrow clay ridge rises just enough to split the breeze. On the upwind side, the surface is clean and faintly firm. On the downwind side, fine dust has gathered in a soft triangular tongue. This dust tongue points away from the wind like a pale arrow laid gently on the ground. It is not permanent. A stronger gust could erase it, and an evening shift in wind could turn the pattern sideways. But for this hour, it tells you how the air has moved through the mounds. The wind has been low, steady, and close to the floor. It has not lifted the whole landscape. It has only taken what was ready to go. That is the quiet skill of deflation. It does not tear solid rock away. It removes loose material from the surface, one grain at a time, until the ground itself is lowered. In the Badlands, this often begins after another process has prepared the grains. Rain breaks clay into flakes. Drying opens cracks. Frost on cold nights can pry at tiny pores. Salt crystals, growing where moisture evaporates, can push grains apart. Then the wind arrives as a patient cleaner. It carries away the pieces that have already loosened. This is why the wind seems subtle when you watch it for a moment, yet powerful when you read its results across centuries. The mound field shows this partnership everywhere. At the base of one rounded knob, a ring of pale chips lies half buried in dust. The chips are thin, curved and dry, like fragments of a shallow bowl. They likely peeled from the side. After wetting and drying weakened the outer skin. Some pieces remain where they fell. Others have been nudged down slope. The finest powder between them has already been lifted away. What remains is a temporary lag of larger fragments. If enough fragments gather, they may protect the clay beneath for a while. If they break apart, the wind will take them farther. This is not a battlefield between forces. It is a sequence of handoffs. Each process prepares the next. The wind crosses the mound field in a loose, wavering path. It does not move as a single sheet. It slows behind every knob, thickens in narrow gaps, and accelerates along smooth channels between raised forms. You can see this by watching where dust is held and where it is missing. In the gaps, the floor has been swept clean, with faint streaks running downwind. Behind larger mounds, dusty pockets rest in rounded patches. Around the smallest caps, grains have collected only on one side, forming miniature drifts that may last until the next change in air. The landscape is reading the wind, but the wind is also reading the landscape. Air follows shape. Shape changes air. Together, they create more shape. At the far edge of the basin, the mounds give way to a steeper bank of layered clay and sandstone. A narrow opening leads through it, and the breeze gathers there more clearly. You follow the opening because the dust continues through it. The passage is only a few steps wide, with walls that rise a little higher than before. Their lower surfaces are smooth and shallowly scooped, while their upper surfaces are rougher and more broken. This difference repeats the lesson, but with stronger detail. Wind-blown sand does most of its cutting near the ground. It travels in low arcs, rarely climbing high, unless the gust is stronger and the particles are fine. The grains that abrade rock are usually heavy enough to stay close to the surface. They bounce, strike, and rebound. They do this again and again. At human height, the wall may be weathered by rain, sun, and frost. At ankle height, it may be polished by sand. That is why the base withdraws. That is why ledges overhang. That is why a cap can end up balanced over a narrowing column. You step closer to the wall and notice the texture of the undercut band. It has a satin look, smoother than the dry, crumbling clay above it. A few tiny grains are embedded in the surface, catching the light as the sun lowers toward midday. The wall is not glossy, it is simply softened by repeated contact. In places, small, harder nodules stand out from the smoother background. They resist the wind better than the clay around them. Each nodule creates a tiny shelter behind it. Dust gathers in the lee of these little projections, the same way it gathers behind larger mounds. Again, the rule repeats at a different scale. A pebble and a hoodoo obey the same quiet geometry. Protection leaves a raised place. Exposure lowers what surrounds it. The passage curves, and a new feature appears ahead. It is a shallow, hollow cut into the base of a slope, wider than the alcove seen earlier. Its ceiling is a thin sandstone lip, and its floor is nearly free of loose sediment. The back wall curves inward gently, as if the slope has been hollowed by a slow, invisible breath. Here, abrasion and deflation have worked together. Wind-blown grains have struck the soft base, smoothing it and enlarging the recess. At the same time, loose dust and clay particles have been carried out, keeping the hollow open. If loose material remained on the floor, it might protect the base from further impacts. But because the hollow is swept clean, new grains can strike fresh surfaces. The form deepens by being emptied. That simple fact gives the space a quiet importance. Removal allows more removal. A small opening becomes an invitation to the next breeze. You stand at the edge of the hollow without entering it. The floor is delicate, marked by faint ripples no taller than a fingernail. The ripples are aligned with the wind, each one formed as grains moved, paused, and gathered at a tiny crest. They are not dunes in the large sense. They are small surface waves, made from the same physics that shapes larger sand fields. When wind moves over loose grains, slight bumps on the surface can slow the air just enough for more grains to settle. The bump grows, and a ripple forms. The windward side is gently sloped. The lee side is a little steeper. Grains climb the windward side, reach the crest, and settle beyond it. In this way, even a ripple moves, grain by grain, downwind. The hollow floor is slowly migrating, not the whole hollow at once, only its skin of loose grains. This motion is quiet enough to disappear into stillness unless you know how to look. Above the hollow, the sandstone lip shows a fine network of cracks. Some cracks run straight across the stone, others branch and fade. Water may enter them during brief rains, and if nights are cold enough, freezing can widen them. Minerals carried by water can also weaken or cement parts of the stone over time. The cap is harder than the clay below, but it is not beyond change. It has its own weathering, its own openings, its own future. A cap survives longer because it resists erosion better, not because it resists forever. This is important. The Badlands are not built from permanent anchors and temporary clay. They are built from materials with different rates of disappearance. Everything is passing. Some things simply pass more slowly. The passage opens again, and the light becomes broader. The recurring capped mound lies behind you now, but the logic of its future has become clearer. Its cap protects, its neck narrows, its base is polished, its lee side stores dust, its windward side loses material. Each of those small facts points toward the same consequence. The mound will become more defined before it becomes less stable. That is the paradox at the heart of many hoodoos. They are carved into beauty by the same processes that eventually undo them. The more the base narrows, the more dramatic the shape becomes. The more dramatic the shape becomes, the more imbalance it holds. The land does not pause at its most graceful stage. It continues. A light gust moves through the opening, and the dust at your feet stirs. The grains do not rise very high. They slide first, then hop, then settle against a tiny ridge. This is surface creep and saltation together. The lowest grains are nudged along by impacts from other grains. The hopping grains carry energy forward and share it each time they land. Finer particles lift into the air and drift beyond the immediate path. All three forms of movement can happen in the same small gust. Creep stays close, saltation hops. Suspension floats away. The terms sound technical, but the motions are simple when you watch them. Some grains roll, some grains jump, some grains become haze. The basin slowly sorts itself through these ordinary movements. The breeze softens again, and the suspended dust settles out of sight. You continue toward a banded slope where pale grey clay lies beneath a warmer sandstone shelf. The shelf is not continuous. It breaks into pieces, some still attached to the slope, others scattered below as fallen slabs. Where the shelf remains, the slope underneath is steeper and more sheltered. Where the shelf has broken away, the clay below has been rounded down. This is a clear record of changing protection. The stone roof once extended farther. Then cracks widened, edges failed, and part of the cap fell. After the fall, the newly exposed clay began to weather faster. The shape of the slope changed not because the entire layer transformed at once, but because one protective piece was removed. A small loss above created a larger lowering below. The fallen slabs at the base are not gone from the story. They now shield patches of floor. Under each slab, the clay is protected from direct rain and wind abrasion. Around each slab, the exposed floor continues to lower. Over time, those slabs may become little caps of their own, resting on shrinking pedestals of softer material. Or they may break apart into smaller fragments. Their future depends on size, hardness, position, and how the water and wind reach them. Even fallen rock can become a beginning. A cap that leaves one place may protect another. The landscape recycles its shelters. The root-down wind takes you across a flat surface where the ground has a faint crust. This crust is not the same as hard bedrock. It is a thin, fragile skin formed by fine particles, minerals, and sometimes living organisms binding the surface together. In dry lands, biological soil crusts can include cyanobacteria, lichens, mosses, and fungi. They grow slowly where conditions allow, often in low, dark, knobby patches between plants. At Bisti, many exposed clay surfaces are too actively eroding or too unstable for thick crusts everywhere. But where crusts do form, they matter. They hold grains in place. They reduce dust lifting. They soften the force of wind at the surface. A living film can become a quiet stabilizer in a carved landscape. You avoid stepping on the darker patches. They are easy to overlook because they do not rise high or call attention to themselves. But their presence changes the movement of sediment. Where the crust is intact, the ground may resist deflation. Where it is broken, loose particles can be lifted quickly. This makes the basin a patchwork not only of rock hardness, but of surface condition. Bare clay, sandy wash, crusted soil, plant roots, pebbled pavement, and fallen slabs all respond differently to the same breeze. The wind is steady, but the ground is varied. That variation creates the complex forms you see. If the whole basin were made of one uniform material, the shapes would be simpler. Bisti is intricate because it is uneven. A small insect track crosses the dusty floor ahead. It loops from the shelter of a low shrub towards a patch of shade beneath a clay edge. The track is delicate, a paired line of tiny marks pressed into the dust. It may not last the day. A gust could soften it. A passing lizard could cross it. A few drops of rain could erase it completely. Still, for now, it belongs to the landscape as much as the hoodoos do. Not every mark in the Badlands is ancient. Some are recent, brief, and nearly weightless. The place holds many times at once. A track from last night lies over sediment from ancient rivers. A dust ripple from this morning forms beside a sandstone cap, millions of years old. A hoodoo's neck narrows over centuries, while one grain moves in a second. The scale changes, but the motion stays patient. Beyond the insect track, a low shrub grows from a slightly raised island of soil. Its branches are sparse, grey-green, and open to the light. Around its base, wind-blown dust has gathered in a soft crescent. The roots hold the soil, while the branches slow the air. This tiny island stands higher than the bare ground around it. Plants in dry badlands often act as anchors, catching sediment and protecting it from removal. They can build small mounds around themselves, even as nearby open surfaces lower. But they can also create turbulence. Wind moving around a shrub may scour one side and deposit on another. The result is not simply protection. It is redistribution. Living things join the pattern gently without taking it over. The wash now broadens into a smoother corridor, and the morning has become late morning. The sun stands higher, reducing the long shadows that earlier made every ridge look sharp. Without those shadows, the basin seems softer and flatter. But the process has not slowed, it is only less visible. This is another lesson in reading Badlands. Light can reveal or hide the same forms. A groove seen at dawn may nearly vanish at noon. A shallow undercut may appear deeper when shadow fills it. A dust tail may glow when low light crosses it, then become invisible under overhead sun. The land does not change that quickly. Your ability to read it does. So you wait near a pale bank until the moving grains become visible again in the lower light along the ground. A gust slips through, and the floor shimmers faintly. The grains flicker sideways, then settle. The motion is small, but it restores the sense of active carving. You are not walking through a finished sculpture garden. You are walking through a place still being edited. The tools are quiet, the revisions are small, but the work continues in front of you. At the edge of the corridor, a narrow fin of sandstone rises from the clay. It is thin, irregular, and only a little taller than your knee. Its long face points roughly into the wind. One side is smoother and more polished. The other side holds more dust in tiny ledges and cracks. This asymmetry tells you how air has moved around it. The windward face receives more direct impacts from saltating grains. The lee side holds calmer pockets where finer particles can settle. Over time, the fin may thin further, break into isolated pieces, or shelter a small ridge of softer material behind it. A fin is not a hoodoo, but it belongs to the same family of differential erosion. It is a resistant remnant standing after softer material nearby has lowered. Its shape is a record of what stayed longer. You trace the fin with your eyes, not your hands. The surface would crumble under careless pressure. That delicacy is easy to forget because stone seems permanent in ordinary thought. But here, stone is often a temporary arrangement of grains, cement, cracks, and weathered edges. Some sandstone can ring hard under a hammer. Some can be rubbed apart by fingers. The difference depends on how tightly the grains are cemented and how deeply weathering has entered. In Bisti, even resistant layers may be thin, patchy, and variable. A cap can protect one column, then fade a few feet away. A ledge can hold firm in one place, then dissolve into slope. This patchiness gives the Badlands their irregular, dreamlike forms. It also gives the wind many opportunities. Where the cap ends, the clay is exposed. Where the clay is exposed, the wash deepens. Where the wash deepens, airflow changes. Where airflow changes, new surfaces are shaped. You return to the idea of the recurring mound as the day advances. It is behind you now, but its small cap has become a key. Every larger form ahead can be understood through it. The field of mounds, the undercut ledges, the hollows, the fins, and the shelves are not separate curiosities. They are variations on a simple relationship. Harder material shields, softer material yields. Wind clears what loosened weathering provides. Water cuts briefly, then disappears. Gravity lowers everything that loses support. Time turns small differences into visible forms. The beauty of the place comes from how many variations the same relationship can create. No two caps protect in exactly the same way. No two columns narrow along the same line. No two hollows catch the same current. The basin feels quiet because the processes are slow, but it feels alive because the pattern is always changing. The path descends slightly into a shallow bowl where the floor is especially clean. The fine dust has been removed, leaving a slightly rougher surface of small grains and fragments. This is deflation made visible. Loose material has been lifted or pushed away until the remaining surface is less easily moved. It is not a perfect pavement, but it is firmer than the dust pockets around it. A few pebbles sit proud on the floor, each surrounded by a tiny moat where finer material has been removed. Their undersides protect small patches of sediment. If the surrounding floor continues to lower, the pebbles may seem to rise, though they have not moved upward at all. This is an illusion made by removal, and it appears often in places where the floor is being quietly lowered. A pebble can become a tiny monument, not because it has grown, but because everything around it has thinned. The same illusion works at larger scales with slabs, caps, ledges, and hoodoos. A stone left in place begins to look important because the softer ground beside it has gone away. You continue across the shallow bowl, careful to keep to the firmer patches where the surface is already compacted. The wind passes over the bowl in thin breaths, lifting only the smallest dust and leaving the coarser grains behind. At the far edge, the ground rises into a low shoulder of pale clay, and beyond it, the basin opens toward taller forms. The change is gradual, but the mood of the land shifts. The mounds are no longer only rounded and low. Ahead, several shapes stand more clearly apart from the floor, with flat stones balanced over narrowed bases. The recurring capped mound has prepared you to read them. Now the same process appears larger, older, and more delicate. The wash bends toward the cluster, and the breeze seems to choose the same direction. It slips along the corridor, gathers a little speed between two clay banks, then spreads into open sunlight. The first tall hoodoo stands near the opening, with a cap of warmer sandstone and a pale column beneath. Its shadow falls to one side, thin and cool, making the column look narrower than it did from a distance. The cap is not centered perfectly. It leans a little towards the east, following a line of weakness in the stone below. Nothing about it feels sudden. It simply carries the evidence of many small decisions made by wind, rain, and gravity. The windward face of the column is smoother, with a soft satin finish near the base. The leeward side holds dust in shallow pockets, especially beneath the uneven rim of the cap. A few flakes lie below the column, pale on their broken edges and darker on their weathered surfaces. They are small, but they matter. They show that the form is not just being polished from outside, it is also loosening from within, along cracks, seams, and changes in texture. You circle the hoodoo slowly, keeping enough distance that the small dust forms at its base remain untouched. From each side, the figure changes. From the northwest, where the wind has been arriving, the lower column is undercut and clean. From the southeast, behind the wind, the base is softer with accumulated dust. From the side, the neck, under the cap, becomes visible as a slender band of clay. This neck is the place where the hoodoo is most clearly divided between shelter and exposure. Above it, the cap casts shade and sheds some rain away. Below it, the column meets moving sand, runoff, and the constant pull of gravity. The cap has preserved the column, but the cap has also made the column stand out, where the wind can reach around it more freely. This is the quiet turning point hidden inside many hoodoos. Protection does not mean stillness. Protection creates a shape, and the shape changes the way air and water move. A broad mound may shed wind gently. A narrowed pedestal splits the wind sharply. Air presses around it, accelerates through gaps and curls into eddies behind it. The more distinct the hoodoo becomes, the more actively the wind can work around its sides. The form begins by surviving. Then it becomes vulnerable because it has survived. The larger cluster ahead shows this in many stages. Some hoodoos are thick and newly separated from the slope behind them. Some are slender, with caps wider than the columns below. Some have already lost their caps and now stand as soft stumps, rounding down into the floor. The basin has arranged time in space. You can walk from youth to old age in a few minutes, not because the forms were born in that order, but because each one has reached a different stage of exposure. The afternoon light strengthens the comparison. Shadows settle beneath capstones, making the sheltered clay appear blue-gray. The sun warms exposed sandstone into tan, ochre, and muted orange. Pale mudstone slopes reflect the light softly, almost like ash. The scene looks still, but the surfaces are full of evidence. A polished base, a fresh flake, a dust pocket, a crack beneath a cap, a sloping apron where loose grains have gathered and waited for the next gust. You keep moving downwind through the cluster, letting the airflow set the path. The corridor is wider here, but the wind is more complex. It divides around hoodoos, falls into small hollows, and emerges in narrow streams between mounds. The moving grains reveal these invisible paths. Near one pedestal, dust slides left. Near another, it curls into a crescent and settles. Between two low fins, grains flicker quickly, as if the air has been gently squeezed. The wind is not stronger everywhere. It is shaped by the Badlands, just as it shapes them. A broad mushroom rock stands near the center of the cluster. Its cap is thicker than the others, with a rough surface and an uneven rim. The column below is pale and slightly fluted, marked by vertical streaks left by water running down after rare rain. At the base, however, the flutes fade into a smoother, wind-polished band. This division is clear. Water has drawn lines downward. Wind has rubbed them away near the ground. Where the two processes meet, the surface is complex, half-grooved, half-smoothed. The capstone has small pits across its top, each one catching a little shadow. Some pits may have formed where softer grains weathered out. Others may have begun in tiny cracks, widened by moisture, salt, or temperature changes. A cap looks like a roof, but it is also a weathering surface. Rainwater sits in its rough places after storms. Sun dries it, cold nights tighten it, warm afternoons expand it. Over long time, these cycles turn small openings into larger weaknesses. The cap protects what is below, while quietly losing its own strength. You pause at the mushroom rock because its base shows a developing groove. The groove curves around the windward half of the column, not as a perfect circle, but as a shallow inward bite. The lee side has no matching groove, only a soft drift of dust pressed against the clay. This difference makes the hoodoo feel directional. It has a face that receives abrasion, and a sheltered side that stores what the wind cannot carry farther. If the prevailing winds remain similar over many seasons, the windward groove may deepen. If storms or shifting seasonal winds change direction, the pattern may blur and move. The shape is not a fixed answer, it is a record of repeated tendencies. Close to the ground, a few sand grains begin to move again. They roll first, then bounce a little as the gust strengthens. A grain strikes the column and drops. Another grain hits the same band and rebounds sideways. The impacts are too small to leave visible marks in the moment, but the band they strike is already smoother than the clay above. That smoothness is the sum of many invisible contacts. This is how wind abrasion becomes legible, not by watching one grain carve a mark, but by seeing what countless grains have done together. Nearby, a smaller hoodoo carries a very thin capstone. The cap is flat, nearly circular, and darker than the clay beneath it. Its column is narrow enough that the cap overhangs on all sides. At first, it seems balanced and calm. Then, from a different angle, a hairline crack appears just below the cap, running partway around the neck. The crack is not wide. It is only a fine dark line, broken in places, easy to miss if the light were different, but it changes the way the form reads. The hoodoo is no longer simply being narrowed from the outside. A weakness has opened within the support. The crack may have begun as drying shrinkage in the clay. It may have followed a thin layer where texture changes, It may have widened after water entered and evaporated, leaving salts to grow between grains. Or it may have opened because the cap's weight is no longer evenly supported. Whatever the cause, the result is the same. The neck has crossed from continuous support into partial separation. The cap still rests in place. The column still holds. But the path toward release has become more certain. There is no sound when you notice it. No falling stone. No sudden shift. Only a line of shadow beneath a small roof of sandstone. Yet in a landscape built by slow differences, a line like this matters. It marks a one-way change. A closed, unbroken neck can narrow for a long time while still holding together. A cracked neck begins to respond differently to weather. Water can enter the crack, wind can clear loosened grains from its edges, heat and cold can work along it more easily. The crack becomes an access point. It gives future erosion a place to return. You stay with this smaller hoodoo because it echoes the recurring capped mound from earlier in the day. The earlier mound was just beginning to show a neck. This one has reached the next stage. It shows what the small marker might become if its cap endures and its base continues to lower. The basin is teaching by comparison. One form begins the lesson, another continues it. A third shows what happens later. The cracked hoodoo stands in afternoon light, neither falling nor whole in the way it once was. Its cap is slightly tilted, though the angle is subtle. The left edge sits closer to the clay than the right. Beneath the lower edge, the shadow is thicker. Beneath the raised edge, a narrow slit of light appears between cap and column. This small tilt may have developed over years, as one side of the neck lost support faster than the other, or it may have shifted during a cold night, after moisture loosened the clay along the crack. The exact moment is not visible. Only the consequence remains. The cap's weight now presses unevenly. That uneven pressure will guide future cracking. It will encourage one side of the column to compress, the other to pull apart. The wind will still sand the base, rain will still run down the sides, but gravity has now joined the form in a more specific way. Not as a general downward force, but as a leaning weight acting through a tilted stone. This is the irreversible midpoint of the hoodoo story. The landscape has crossed from preservation into release. Still, the release may take years. It may take many seasons of sun, rain, frost, salt and wind. In Bisti, visible change can be both real and nearly silent. A cap may tilt a fraction and then remain for a long while. A crack may deepen slowly without widening enough for the eye to notice. The important thing is not spectacle, it is direction. The form cannot return to its earlier balance. You look around the cluster and begin to see similar evidence everywhere. A thick cap with a fresh chip missing from one rim, a column with a vertical crack following a pale seam, a foreman slab resting beside a low stump, a mushroom rock whose lee side has stored enough dust to partly bury its base. Each one is a different sentence in the same quiet paragraph. Shelter becomes height. Height becomes exposure. Exposure becomes thinning. Thinning becomes imbalance. Imbalance becomes fall. After the fall, the material does not vanish. It becomes sediment again, ready for the next shape. The wind passes across the cracked hoodoo and lifts a little dust from the floor. The grains move around the base in two streams, dividing on the windward side and meeting again behind it. In the lee, the air slows enough for the finest particles to settle. A soft wedge grows there, no higher than a fingertip. If it remains, it may protect that side from some abrasion. If the wind shifts, it may be removed. The wedge is temporary, but it still affects the next contact between air and clay. Small deposits are not passive. They change where wind can touch. They create little shields, little ramps, and little surfaces of their own. This is why Badlands are so richly textured. Erosion is not only removal, it is also short-term storage. A grain moves, rests, protects, then moves again. The sun begins to lower, and the hoodoo shadows lengthen. The cracked neck becomes darker, easier to see. You step back from the small, tilted cap and let the wider field enter the frame. Around it, dozens of forms stand at different heights, with different caps, colors, and degrees of wear. Some are only knobs emerging from slopes. Some are pedestals with wide shoulders, some are thin columns that seem almost separate from the ground. Others have already collapsed into piles of capstone and clay rubble. Together, they make the basin feel like a natural archive of changing balance. The earlier recurring mound is part of this archive now, even if it sits behind you along the wash. Its future is not mysterious in a general sense. It may narrow, it may crack, its cap may tilt, it may fall, but the exact path will depend on details too small to predict. A harder seam here, a root there, a storm from one direction. A winter night cold enough for frost, a gust carrying sand at just the right height. The future shape is guided, but not fully written. That uncertainty keeps the land open. It is not a machine repeating one form. It is a conversation among materials. You move downwind from the cracked hoodoo, following the longer shadows across the cluster. The floor slopes gently into a broad basin scattered with mushroom rocks, low fins, and ribbed clay mounds. Late afternoon makes the field easier to read. Every raised edge casts a line. Every hollow gathers shade. Every cap draws a dark band under itself, showing where shelter has slowed the loss below. The forms no longer seem like isolated curiosities. They arrange themselves as stages. At the upwind edge of the basin, small capped knobs rise just above the floor. Their caps are modest, and their bases are still wide. These are early forms, where differential erosion has begun but not yet produced tall columns. A little farther downwind, the knobs become taller, with clearer necks and deeper grooves at their bases. Farther still, thin hoodoos stand with caps wider than their supports. Beyond them, broken stumps and fallen slabs mark later stages. The sequence is not a straight timeline for the whole basin, but it is a visible set of possibilities. You can trace how a mound may become a pedestal, how a pedestal may become a hoodoo, how a hoodoo may lose its cap, how the uncapped column may soften, round, and return to the plane. The cracked hoodoo from the cluster now feels less singular. Its slight tilt belongs to a wider pattern. This makes the change gentler. It is not an accident against the landscape. It is part of the way the landscape continues. Near a broken stump, the fallen capstone rests on the ground like a low table. Around its edges, the floor has lowered slightly, leaving the slab perched over a thin apron of protected sediment. The old cap has begun protecting a new place. Under it, clay remains shaded and less disturbed. Beside it, exposed clay has cracked, flaked, and lost dust to the wind. If enough time passes and the slab stays intact, a tiny pedestal may form beneath it. The end of one hoodoo can become the beginning of another. This recycling is one of the quietest revelations in the Badlands. Collapse is not simply disappearance. It is redistribution of shelter. The stone changes position, and the pattern begins again at another scale. You move beside a ribbed slope where thin layers run nearly horizontal across the face. Each rib stands slightly proud because it resists weathering more than the softer beds between. The spaces between ribs are smoother and more recessed. Rainwater has drawn vertical lines through them, cutting small channels down the slope. Wind has then cleared the loosened material from the base of those channels. The slope is a weave of directions. Horizontal layers record ancient deposition. Vertical rills record recent runoff. Low polished bands record wind abrasion. The form holds several times and processes at once. At the foot of the slope, a pale apron of sediment spreads into the basin. The apron is not evenly mixed. Coarser chips lie close to the slope. Finer dust has traveled farther and gathered in shallow swales. This sorting shows gravity and wind dividing the fallen material. Gravity drops fragments downslope. Wind lifts and carries the smaller grains away. A fragment's future depends partly on its size. Large pieces remain near their source, sheltering what lies beneath. Medium grains creep and hop. Fine dust may leave the basin entirely, joining the dry air as a faint veil. The Badlands are being sorted as they erode. They are not only losing material, they are separating it. A low fin stands beyond the ribbed slope, shaped like a narrow wall with a ragged top. One face is lit, the other in shade. The fin follows a harder sandstone layer that once extended into softer surrounding material. As the softer beds lowered, the harder strip remained as a ridge. Now wind attacks both sides. The fin may thin along cracks and break into separate blocks. Those blocks may become small caps, or they may crumble and vanish into the general sediment. Nothing in the field has only one possible future, but every future begins with the same quiet differences: hardness, position, exposure, wind direction, time. The basin gives these variables room to work. Sparse vegetation appears in the spaces between the forms. A saltbush or rabbit brush grows where a little more soil has gathered. A clump of grass holds a small mound around its roots. In the lee of one shrub, dust has piled in a feathered tail. On the upwind side, the surface is swept and slightly scoured. The plant is both anchor and obstacle. It holds some sediment close, while changing the wind enough to move other sediment away. The living pieces of the desert are modest here, but they matter. They create small shelters, roughness, and shadows. They help decide which grains remain long enough to form a surface. Near the shrubs, the ground shows faint signs of biological crust. Darker, knobbly patches lie between pale dust and clay. These crusts can take a long time to develop in dry country. They are made by tiny living communities that bind grains together, especially near the surface. When intact, they reduce erosion. They keep fine particles from lifting too easily. They also hold a little moisture after rain, changing how the surface dries and cracks. That small delay can matter because a surface that dries slowly may shrink differently from bare clay beside it. Tiny cracks may open in one patch and not in another, giving the next wind a new pattern to test. So even the thin living skin of the desert becomes part of the carving, quiet but active. You keep your steps to the open wash floor, where previous water has already made a natural path. The crusted patches remain to either side, dark and low, holding their grains with a strength that is easy to underestimate. In a landscape shaped by removal, anything that holds the surface becomes important. A plant root, a pebble, a crust, a capstone, a fallen slab, all can slow the wind for a little while. The field ahead is wide now, and late afternoon lays every form into relief. Mushroom rocks stand beside cracked clay mounds, and low fins point across the basin like worn pages of stone. Some forms look newly lifted from the floor, with broad bases and small caps. Others are narrow and pale, their upper stones wider than the columns beneath them. Still others have already lost their caps, leaving rounded stumps that are settling back toward the plain. The reveal is not that the field contains many shapes. The reveal is that the shapes belong to one long sequence. Birth, shelter, thinning, fracture, fall, and return are all visible at once. You move downwind to follow that sequence, beginning with the youngest forms near the edge of the basin. Here, small capped knobs rise only a little above the surrounding clay. Their capstones are thin, sometimes no larger than a dinner plate, and their columns are still thick. The wind has begun to clear loose sediment around them, but the bases have not yet narrowed deeply. These early knobs show how little is needed to begin a Badlands sculpture. A patch of harder sandstone rests above softer mudstone, and the softer material around it lowers first. The cap does not lift the mound upward. It simply lets the mound remain while the nearby floor is carried away. This is one of the quiet illusions of erosion. The protected place seems to rise because the exposed place beside it has lowered. You pass one of these young capped knobs and notice the shallow moat around it. The moat is not filled with water, but with a faint ring of swept clay and loose grains. On the windward side, the ring is cleaner and slightly polished. On the lee side, dust has settled in a soft crescent, protected from the strongest flow. Already the little mound has a direction and a memory. Already it is changing the wind that changes it. A few steps farther on, the capped knobs become taller. Their bases have withdrawn, and their sides are steeper beneath the small roofs of stone. The caps cast longer shadows now, because the sun is lower, and those shadows show the protected clay below. Under each cap, the surface appears smoother and less cracked than the exposed slopes around it. The stone overhead has reduced direct rainfall and slowed some weathering from above. But the sides remain open. Wind-blown grains reach them at low angles, especially close to the ground. Rainwater reaches them from the edges, running down in narrow streaks after brief storms. As a result, the column survives in the center, but thins along the outside. This is the stage where shelter becomes shape. You pause beside one pedestal that is slightly taller than the rest. Its cap is warm tan, and its column is pale grey, with a faint greenish tone in the shade. The neck is broad enough to hold the cap easily, but a shallow groove circles the lower half. That groove is the first warning that balance is temporary. The form looks stable in this moment, but the process has a direction. If the cap remains, the column may stand longer. If the groove deepens, the column may narrow. If the cap cracks or shifts, the entire balance changes. Nothing here is frozen at the stage you see. Every form is a passing arrangement of protection and exposure. The next group downwind shows the same arrangement farther along. These hoodoos are slimmer, with caps that project beyond their columns on one or more sides. Some caps look like flat hats. Others are irregular slabs, thicker on one edge, chipped on another, and stained with iron-rich minerals. The columns beneath them are not perfectly vertical. They lean, swell, narrow, and twist, according to old layers and recent erosion. A clay column is not a carved post. It is a remnant left where surrounding material disappeared faster. Its shape reflects every unevenness in the material that remained. You circle a slender hoodoo slowly, watching how each side has aged differently. The windward face is smoother and cleaner near the base. The lee face holds a narrow pocket of dust, tucked beneath the overhanging cap. One side has a pale vertical crack descending from the neck. The opposite side is rounded and unbroken, at least on the surface. This one hoodoo contains several histories at once. Abrasion has polished one face, deposition has softened another. Drying or stress has opened a crack. The cap has sheltered some clay while exposing other edges to runoff. The result is not symmetrical because the forces and materials were never symmetrical. The wind moves through the field in a low stream, visible only where grains catch the light. It splits around this slender hoodoo and gathers again behind it. In the sheltered wake, dust settles into a little wedge, adding a temporary apron to the base. That apron may slow abrasion on the lee side for a time, but if tomorrow's wind shifts, the apron may be lifted and carried into the next hollow. The shape of a hoodoo is made not only by what is removed, but by what pauses nearby. Sediment rests, protects, loosens and moves again. The ground is always exchanging small gifts with itself. Farther downwind, the field enters an older stage. Here, caps lie on the ground beside short stumps. Some slabs are whole enough to preserve their shape. Others have split into angular blocks, with fresh faces lighter than their weathered surfaces. The columns they once protected are now low, rounded mounds. Without caps, they are exposed from above and from the sides, and they lose their form more evenly. The once sheltered material becomes ordinary slope again. Its edges soften. Its height lowers. Its identity as a hoodoo fades back into the broader basin. This is not a failure of the form. It is the next part of the sequence. A fallen cap casts shade where it now rests, and the ground beneath it begins a new pattern. You crouch beside one fallen slab and see a narrow lip of protected clay underneath its edge. The exposed floor around it has lowered slightly, leaving the slab almost perched above a thin base. A new miniature pedestal is beginning beneath what used to be an ending. This is one of the most delicate cause and effect links in the field. The cap fell from one hoodoo, but it did not leave the process. It became a cap for another patch of clay. The shape was redistributed, not erased. The old column returned to sediment, and the old cap began a different kind of shelter. A few insects moved near the edge of the slab, leaving dotted tracks across the dust. Their paths cross the wind streaks and vanish under a low grass stem. The marks are recent, fragile, and almost weightless. They sit among features that took centuries to form and among sediments laid down millions of years ago. The Badlands hold these times without separating them. Ancient coastal mud lies under a track from last night. A capstone that protected a hoodoo for generations now shelters a beetle trail from the afternoon wind. The same surface can be both old and new, depending on how closely you look. The late light deepens, and the colors grow softer. Gray clay becomes lavender in the shadows. Tan sandstone warms to honey and rust. Dark seams appear again where thin, coal-rich layers cross the slopes. These seams remind you that the dry basin once held wet, low places filled with plants. Those plants grew, fell, and were buried in swampy ground. Pressure and time changed their remains into thin, dark bands. Now the bands weather out as lines in a desert wall. They are softer in some places, harder in others, and they influence how the slope breaks. A dark seam may crumble faster than the sandstone above it. It may become a groove. That groove may catch moisture. The moisture may widen the weakness. The wind may clear the loosened grains. An ancient swamp becomes a modern notch, and a notch becomes a path for more change. You follow one of these dark seams along a low bank. It disappears beneath a patch of fallen dust, then returns as a thin shadow under a projecting ledge. The seam is not continuous in a simple way. It pinches, thickens, vanishes, and reappears because the original environment was patchy. Swamps shifted. River channels cut through them. Floods covered them with mud or sand. Volcanic ash settled unevenly across the plain. The wind now exposes that old patchiness, making it visible as ledges, hollows, caps, and ribs. The present landscape is not random because the past was not uniform. Every old variation becomes a modern opportunity for erosion. A low clay mound beside the seam is cracked across its crown. The cracks form a loose polygon pattern, like a drying lake bed made small. Clay minerals can shrink when they lose moisture and swell slightly when they take it in. In a dry climate, repeated wetting and drying can open and reopen cracks near the surface. Those cracks help break the mound into smaller pieces. When the pieces dry, they curl or flake. Then the wind carries away the finest particles between them. The mound lowers, not as one solid block, but as a surface slowly dividing itself into removable fragments. You can see a few of those fragments at the base. They are curled like thin chips, pale on one side and slightly darker where mineral staining has touched them. Some chips are large enough to remain for weeks or seasons. Others have already broken into powder. The next wind will sort them by size. The larger ones will stay close, protecting little patches of clay beneath them. The smaller grains will creep, hop, or lift into suspension. The field is not only shaped from above by weather, it is shaped from within by the way its own surfaces break apart. The breeze quiets for a moment, and the basin seems to hold still. Then a faint movement returns along the ground, passing through a gap between two low fins. The dust there moves more quickly because the air is gently constricted. Where the gap opens again, the grains spread and slow, settling into a fan-shaped veil. This fan is thin enough to disappear under one footstep, but it is also a clear record of airflow. A narrow passage accelerates the wind. An open basin slows it. Acceleration lifts and moves grains. Slowing drops them. The same pattern appears in canyons, dunes, washes, and even around single stones. Here, it is written in a fan of dust, no thicker than a breath. You keep following that fan to where it meets the older stumps. The stumps have no caps, and their tops are rounded by direct weathering. Without a stone roof, rain strikes them more evenly. Sun dries them more evenly. Wind reaches their upper surfaces more easily. They no longer hold the sharp contrast between protected column and exposed surroundings. Their forms are becoming less distinct. This is the quiet return stage. A hoodoo does not vanish all at once. It becomes a stump, then a mound, then a low rise, then part of the wash floor. Each stage leaves sediment for the next. A small animal track crosses the side of one rounded stump. The prints are shallow, perhaps from a rodent moving between shrubs during the cooler hours. The track curves around the mound rather than over the highest point. Even such light movement can disturb a little dust and expose grains to wind. In a broad sense, animals are minor agents compared with water, wind, and rock hardness. But at the surface scale, their traces can matter for a moment. A burrow can loosen sediment, a path can break a crust, a track can make a faint groove where dust gathers. Life here is quiet, but it still enters the erosion story. You see another sign near a clump of grass, where tiny seeds and plant litter have collected in a sheltered pocket. Organic material is scarce in the open badlands, so even a little plant debris changes the surface. It can trap moisture, it can catch dust, it can feed small soil organisms. It can help a crust begin if the surface remains stable long enough. But if the next storm washes through, or if wind scours the pocket clean, the beginning is removed. Stability in this landscape is always local and conditional. A plant may hold one patch while a bare slope lowers beside it. A crust may protect a square foot while a nearby wash cuts deeper. A cap may preserve one column while its neighbor loses height. The field becomes a mosaic of small outcomes. You turn back toward the cracked hoodoo from earlier in the afternoon. It is partly hidden now by a low fin, but its tilted cap is still visible above the pale forms. The angle of sunlight makes the tilt easier to read. The lower edge of the cap throws a darker, thicker shadow. The raised edge admits a narrow line of brightness. The crack around the neck is no wider than before, yet it feels more meaningful after walking through the older stumps. You have seen where this kind of change can lead. You have seen caps on the ground. You have seen columns rounding down. You have seen fallen slabs beginning new shelters. The tilted cap is not a dramatic event. It is a position within a long, visible sequence. That recognition softens the scene rather than sharpening it. The hoodoo is not in danger. It is simply participating in the same patient transformation as the basin around it. The wind lifts briefly, then slackens again. A few grains strike the base of the tilted hoodoo, and a few more settle behind it. The cap does not move. The crack does not open before your eyes. Most of the important work happens below the threshold of immediate perception. This is why staying matters in a place like Bisti. If you pass quickly, the Badlands look like a collection of strange shapes. If you stay with one corridor, one cap, one breeze, the shapes begin to reveal their causes. The land teaches through repetition. A notch here answers a notch there. A fallen slab explains a tilted cap. A dust tail repeats the geometry of a hoodoo. The field grows calmer as the sun lowers. Long shadows extend from every capstone and ridge, joining across the wash floor. The shadows make temporary connections between forms that are physically separate. A young knob, a slender hoodoo, and a broken stump all fall into the same band of shade. For a few minutes, the sequence appears almost as one continuous shape. Then the light shifts and the connections change. This is not erosion, but it affects how you read erosion. The landscape's forms remain, but meaning moves with the light. Late afternoon is one of the clearest times to see subtle relief. Low sunlight turns shallow grooves into lines. It turns small dust fans into bright wedges. It turns the underside of caps into dark, legible spaces. You follow the shadow of one cap across the ground to a patch where the surface is pebbled. The pebbles form a loose armor over finer clay. They may have been left behind by deflation after smaller particles were carried away. They may also have arrived from a weathered sandstone layer upslope. Either way, their presence changes the wind's access to the surface. A grain of dust beneath the pebble layer is less available. A grain exposed between pebbles can still be lifted. The armor is incomplete, but even incomplete protection slows lowering. Nearby bare clay without such cover shows more cracks and shallow scours. The difference between these surfaces may be only a few inches apart. Yet over time, that difference can grow into relief. Protection is cumulative. Exposure is cumulative. The basin's texture comes from these small separations enlarging slowly. A little farther on, a smooth, pale dome rises from the floor with no cap at all. Its shape is low, rounded, and almost featureless compared with the hoodoos. The dome may be a firmer body of mudstone or sandstone weathering more evenly than the surrounding clay. Without a cap to create sharp shelter, it has no deep neck and no overhang. Rain slides over it, wind crosses it. Cracks open and soften across its top. The dome lowers with less drama, becoming smaller without producing a tall column. This form is another possible path. Not every resistant patch becomes a hoodoo. Some become domes, some become fins, some become shelves, some simply slow the lowering of the ground. The wind can only carve from the materials and structures it is given. The root downwind carries you beyond the dome to a shallow channel. The channel is dry, but its floor is marked by tiny rills from a past rain. The rills curve around small obstructions, join, and fade into the broader wash. Their edges are sharp in places, soft in others. Where wind has crossed them repeatedly, the edges have been lowered and dust has been cleared from the bottoms. Where sheltered, fine sediment partly fills them. This channel shows water's brief work and wind's longer editing. Rain cuts the first lines. Wind decides which loose grains remain. Gravity pulls small pieces from the rill edges. Sun dries the clay and prepares new cracks. The next rain will find a slightly altered path. The next wind will clean a slightly altered floor. Each process inherits the results of the previous one. There is a quiet consequence in that inheritance. No gust begins with a blank surface. No storm begins with a blank surface. Every event works on a landscape already shaped by earlier events. A hoodoo's future depends on old layers, recent cracks, fallen dust, current wind direction, and yesterday's moisture. The Badlands are not made by one force acting alone. They meet on the same surface, each leaving a small invitation for the next. The more you follow the channel, the more the basin feels like a collaboration. A grain loosened by swelling clay may wait until the afternoon breeze arrives. A flake opened by frost may rest for weeks before a gust slides beneath it. A groove cut by rain may become a sheltered guide for dust, insects, and seeds. Nothing works alone, and nothing keeps its work entirely to itself. The shallow channel leads into a lower pocket where late light gathers softly. Here, the floor is smoother, and the surrounding mounds are shorter, as if the field has already passed through several cycles of shaping. A few fallen capstones lie partly buried, with only their warmer upper surfaces exposed. Around each one, the clay floor has a slightly raised rim where protected sediment remains. That rim shows that shelter can continue long after the original hoodoo has disappeared. The slab no longer crowns a column, but it still changes the rate of loss beneath it. This is one reason the basin never resets. Material moves, but its influence moves with it. A capstone falls, and the wind must flow around a new obstacle. A mound lowers, and the next wash takes a slightly different path. A dust pocket forms, and the next gust strikes a softer surface than before. Each change is modest, yet each change alters the conditions for everything that follows. You look back across the field and see the tilted hoodoo in the distance. Its cap sits among many others, but now your eye returns to it more easily. The crack below it is not visible from here, only the slight lean of the stone. That lean is enough. It connects the active field behind you with the quieter evening ahead. The hoodoo has crossed a threshold, and the night will test that threshold without hurry. The sun lowers toward the western mesas, and the basin begins to cool from the top down. Warm light remains on the capstones, while the clay slopes beneath them slip into shadow. This difference in heating matters because stone and clay do not release warmth in exactly the same way. Sandstone may hold the day's heat a little longer. Fine clay can cool more quickly at the surface, especially where the air is dry. As temperatures change, materials expand and contract by tiny amounts. The movement is too small to see, but repeated over time, it can widen cracks. A hairline opening under a cap can become more receptive to moisture, salt, and frost. A small seam in a slope can become the line along which a flake separates. Even cooling has a shape-making role. It does not carve like wind-blown sand. It prepares edges, weakens bonds, and gives future erosion a place to begin. The light continues to fade, and shadows stretch until they join inside the wash. The forms lose some of their sharpness, but the air becomes more readable. As the ground cools, a faint drainage wind begins to slide down the basin. This kind of evening flow is gentle and close to the surface. Cooler air, slightly heavier, moves from higher ground into lower washes. It follows the same shallow corridors that morning dust followed, but with a different feeling. The day's breeze crossed the basin under the sun. The evening wind seems to pour through the channels, quiet and low. You remain in the same corridor, because the decision now is to watch change without seeking new scenery. The field has already shown its stages. Now the same forms enter a different part of their daily cycle. A hoodoo that was warmed on one face begins cooling unevenly. A crack that was dry all afternoon takes in colder air. A dust pocket that rested in shade thickens slightly as grains settle out of the slowing flow. The land appears to be going still, but its surfaces keep adjusting. A thin veil of dust moves along the wash floor. It is not as bright as it was in the sun, but it can be seen where it crosses pale clay. The grains slide and pause, like a low whisper written on the ground. Near a fallen slab, the dust divides into two small streams. One stream follows the slab's edge, where the air is squeezed through a narrow gap. The other drifts into the open lee side, slowing and settling. By morning, this may leave a new crescent of fine sediment against the stone. That crescent may protect one edge for a while, or feed the next small drift. The night begins not with absence, but with a change in pace. The Badlands become less visible, yet the processes become more intimate. The sun is no longer pulling moisture from the surface as strongly. The air near the ground cools. In some low pockets, a trace of humidity may gather, especially after a previous storm or a cool season night. Clay can respond to even slight moisture changes. Some clay minerals take in water along their surfaces and between tiny layers. When they dry again, they shrink. That swelling and shrinking helps break the surface into chips and flakes. It is a slow breathing of the ground, too small and mineral to resemble life, but rhythmic all the same. The basin inhales moisture when conditions allow. It exhales dust when the wind returns. Along the base of a ribbed slope, the evening wind clears a narrow line of loose grains. The freshly exposed clay is darker for a little while, because it has not yet weathered to the same pale surface. A few inches above it, thin flakes remain attached to the wall. Their edges are lifted, and tiny shadows lie beneath them. They may stay through the night. They may drop after a cold hour, when contraction pulls one layer away from another. If they fall, they will land near the base, adding to the apron of fragments. Then the wind will begin its sorting again. Large flakes will rest, smaller grains will creep, fine powder will lift. The field does not need a large event to keep changing. It only needs the continuing cycle of loosening and removal. You move slowly back toward the tilted hoodoo, following the wash that led away from it earlier. The route feels different in the dimming light. Forms that were separate by color now merge by tone. The tan capstones darken. The pale clay turns blue-gray. The dark seams almost disappear, except where they cut across exposed slopes as narrow bands. Because the eye has less detail, small sounds become more noticeable. A faint rustle of dry grass, a soft tick of a grain touching stone, the almost inaudible slide of dust along a smooth, wash floor. The basin does not become silent in a complete sense. It becomes quiet enough for small movements to matter. At a bend in the wash, a low bank shows a fresh-looking crack. It runs diagonally through pale mudstone, crossing a faint horizontal layer. The crack may not have formed today. It may only be easier to see now, because shadow fills it. But it still marks a weakness. If rain reaches it, water can enter. If night becomes cold enough, freezing water can push its sides apart. If salts are present in the pore spaces, evaporating moisture can leave crystals that grow and press between grains. These actions are gentle at the scale of a moment, but persistent at the scale of a landscape. They make the wall ready for the next wind. Wind often receives credit because it is visible when dust moves. Yet much of its work depends on preparation. It cannot easily lift grains still locked inside solid bedrock. It cannot polish a surface unless loose sand is available to strike it. It cannot deepen a hollow unless the hollow offers material to remove. So the night's hidden processes matter greatly. Cooling tightens, moisture enters, salts crystallize, frost pries where cold is deep enough. Gravity waits for support to fail. Then wind returns as the cleaner, the sorter, and the carrier. The tilted hoodoo appears ahead, darker than the open floor around it. Its cap is a low shape against the fading sky, no longer warm with sun. The crack beneath it is hidden in shadow now. You approach from the lee side, where afternoon dust had gathered in a small wedge. The wedge remains, but its edge is softer. Evening drainage wind has brushed across it from a slightly different angle. The result is a blurred crescent instead of the sharper form seen earlier. This small change is evidence that the wind direction has shifted with cooling. The basin's daily rhythm has altered the air's path. The cap itself seems still. No visible grain falls from the neck. No new fracture opens in the moment. Yet beneath the overhang, the shadow is thick, and the column's surface is divided by tiny textures. Some patches are smooth from abrasion. Some are rough where flakes have recently loosened, some show faint vertical streaks from old runoff, some carry a powdery skin that can be removed by the next passing grains. The hoodoo is a meeting place for many kinds of change. Its future will not be decided by one force but by their sequence. You stand on the upwind side of the evening flow and watch dust gather at the base. The wind now comes more from the slope behind you, sliding down through the wash. It meets the hoodoo at a slightly different angle than the morning breeze did. That angle matters. A surface polished under one wind may become sheltered under another. A dust pocket stored in the lee during the day may be trimmed after sunset. The hoodoo carries records of prevailing patterns, but it also receives daily variation. Not every gust repeats the last. Some strengthen existing grooves, some soften them, some move sediment from one side of the base to another. Over time, the dominant directions remain legible, but smaller reversals add texture. The evening darkens further, and the sky above the basin turns pale violet. Low ridges become silhouettes. The broad forms of the Badlands settle into a quieter arrangement. Without strong light, the hoodoos look less like separate sculptures and more like uneven breathing in the land. Their caps are small, dark plains. Their columns are shadows joined to the floor. The tilted hoodoo remains at the center of attention, not because it is large, but because its change is known. You have followed it from early evidence to visible imbalance. That knowledge creates continuity through the dimness. The land is not anonymous now. It contains a particular form with a particular fracture and a particular future. A small flake rests below the hoodoo's neck, near the base of the column. It was not obvious earlier from the opposite side. Its broken face is lighter than the surrounding dust, and its shape fits the clay above. It may have fallen recently. It may have been hidden by angle and shadow. Either way, it confirms that the neck is shedding material. The flake is small, no larger than a fingernail, but because it came from a narrow support, its importance is larger than its size. A hoodoo can lose many grains from its sides without much visible change, but grains lost from a thinning neck affect balance more directly. Here, location gives meaning to scale. The drainage wind brushes the flake and nudges fine powder away from its edges. The flake itself remains. It is too large for this gentle flow. Later, if it dries further, cracks, or is struck by other grains, it may break into smaller pieces. Those pieces may join the moving sediment. For now, the flake shelters a tiny patch of floor. Even material freshly removed becomes protective for a time. This is the basin's recurring pattern again. Loss in one place becomes cover in another. No fragment is only debris. Each piece becomes a surface, an obstacle or a storehouse of future dust. Night comes gradually, without a sharp boundary. The last warm color leaves the sandstone caps. The pale clay holds a faint glow for a while, then dims. Stars begin to appear above the open basin, and the Badlands settle under a larger darkness. The wind remains low. It slips along the wash rather than crossing the ridges. This low movement is important because the same shallow corridors that guide water after storms can guide cool air at night. A wash is not only a path for runoff, it is also a path for sediment and air. Its shape continues to matter even when it is dry. You stay with the corridor, listening to the ground level motion. There is no need to move quickly now. The major forms are barely visible, and the smaller forms can only be understood by memory. The dust tail behind the shrub, the pebble pavement in the shallow bowl, the ribbed slope with fresh flakes, the fallen capstone protecting a new patch, the tilted hoodoo with the small flake beneath its neck. Each detail remains in the mind as the landscape darkens. This is how a night in the Badlands can still be read. You carry the day's evidence into the darkness. The cooling ground changes the behavior of the air close to the surface. Warm afternoon turbulence fades, and the flow becomes more layered. In open desert basins, calm-looking nights can still move fine sediment in small pulses. A slight pressure change, a drainage flow, or a distant breeze can send grains creeping along exposed surfaces. The movement is not continuous everywhere. It occurs in paths, gaps, and low channels. A clean wash floor may receive it. A crusted patch may resist it. A shrub may interrupt it. The result is a night of selective motion. Only the ready grains travel. Only the open surfaces give them away. The tilted hoodoo stands within that selective motion. On its newly shaded side, the air is calm enough for dust to settle. On the side facing the drainage flow, the base is brushed clean. The crack under the cap remains dark. If moisture gathers along that crack, even slightly, it may change the way the clay grains hold together. If salts are present, drying tomorrow may leave tiny crystals in the opening. If the night becomes cold enough, water and small pores may freeze and expand. Not every night brings frost. Not every crack receives moisture. But over many seasons, these possibilities accumulate. The hoodoo's imbalance means it is more sensitive to each small contribution. A whole thick column can absorb more change without visible consequence. A narrowed, cracked neck has less margin. This is not urgency, it is direction. The cap continues to rest there, heavy and quiet. The column continues to hold it, but the old balance has already been altered. A soft sigh of wind passes through the nearby shrubs. Their branches move only slightly, but the dust at their bases shifts. The shrub mounds show how life changes the night flow. During the day, their shadows slowed evaporation in small patches. Their roots held grains together. Their stems caught wind-blown dust. At night, they break the drainage wind into eddies. Some grains settle under the branches. Others are scoured from the exposed side. The plant is a tiny weather system. Its effects are local, but the Badlands are made from local effects repeated across wide ground. The biological crusts are almost invisible now. By day, their darker surfaces looked knobbly and low. At night, they disappear into the general floor. Still, their role continues. A crusted patch holds fine particles against the wind. An uncrusted patch releases them. If a crust was cracked by drying, those cracks may become edges for tomorrow's erosion. If the crust remains intact, it may keep a small area raised as nearby dust leaves. Even when unseen, the living skin of the desert changes what the wind can reach. This is one reason the basin's surfaces vary so much over short distances. The materials below matter. The life above matters. The airflow matters. The wash floor near the hoodoo feels slightly firmer where coarser grains remain. The finer material has been removed again and again, leaving a rougher lag behind. This lag is incomplete, but it reduces further deflation in that exact patch. Beside it, a smoother clay surface remains more vulnerable, a difference that begins as grain size becomes a difference in height. A difference in height changes the airflow. Changed airflow changes the next pattern of erosion. The cycle is quiet, but it is self-reinforcing. A place that lowers can guide more movement. A place that resists can stand higher and provide shelter. During the darkest hours, the basin seems most still. The stars are clear above the open ground. The hoodoos and fins become low shapes without color. Only the faintest pale surfaces remain visible where the sky reflects off clay. Yet the silence is not empty. Thermal contraction continues in the stone. Tiny grains settle out of the air. Dust shifts inside sheltered pockets. The crack beneath the tilted cap experiences another cycle of cooling. The hoodoo is not asleep in a human sense. It is simply moving through processes too slow and small for ordinary attention. A cold pocket settles in the lower wash. The air there feels different, heavier and calmer. In such pockets, moisture can condense more easily if conditions are right. A thin film on mineral surfaces may be enough to loosen fine particles or activate salts. When water evaporates later, dissolved minerals can crystallize. Those crystals grow in pores and along cracks, pressing grains apart. This process is called salt weathering, but the idea is simple. Water enters with dissolved material. Water leaves. Crystals remain and expand. The surface becomes weaker. Then the wind removes what has loosened. The Badlands' dryness does not mean water is absent from the story. It means water often acts briefly, in small quantities, and with strong after effects. A short rain can carve rills. A night's humidity can change clay surfaces. A thin film can move salts. A cold spell can freeze moisture in pores. Then long dry intervals give wind time to clear the evidence. This alternation creates much of the basin's texture. Water begins many openings. Wind lengthens their influence. Gravity gathers what is no longer supported. Sun dries everything and prepares the cycle again. Near the tilted hoodoo, The small flake below the neck remains in place through the night. Dust gathers against its downwind edge. A faint ridge forms there, too small to notice without remembering where the flake lay before. The ridge changes the next airflow at the base. It may divert grains slightly away from one side of the column. It may also hold a trace of moisture longer in the morning shade. By itself, that little ridge is almost nothing, but it changes what the next hour can do. Before dawn, the basin reaches its coldest point, and the clay holds the night in a thin surface skin. The tilted cap remains in place, but the neck below it has passed through another cycle of contraction. Somewhere inside the fine layers, grains have shifted by distances too small to measure here. The change is not a fall, and not even a visible break. It is a quiet loss of certainty. When the eastern sky begins to pale, the first light does not strike the hoodoo directly. It touches the higher sandstone rims first, then slides down the slopes in slow bands. The wash floor brightens, and the small flake beneath the neck appears again. Around it, a narrow fan of dust has formed during the night, shaped by the drainage wind. This is the first evidence of morning, not the sun itself, but the new arrangement of loose grains around a fallen piece. You look from the flake to the crack above it, and the relationship is clearer now. The hoodoo has not changed in a spectacular way, but it has been edited. A small piece has left the neck, and the ground has already begun using it. The fresh grain edges below the cap catch the weak light more brightly than the older weathered clay. That brightness marks recent exposure. It shows where the surface was protected inside the column until it opened to air. Now that new surface will dry, soften, crack, and meet wind like everything around it. The cap still rests on the column. Its tilt is still modest. But the form has entered the morning with a slightly different geometry than it had the day before. That difference is the aftermath the basin offers. A small scatter of grains lies below the tilted side, mixed with a few thin flakes. Some pieces are large enough to remain where they fell. Others are fine enough that the first steady breeze will take them. The wind has not fully arrived yet, but the wash is already preparing to carry them. As the sun rises, the air near the ground begins to warm unevenly. Cool pockets linger in shaded hollows, while open clay surfaces brighten and dry. This uneven warming stirs the lowest air, and the first daylight breeze returns to the corridor. It comes softly from the same general direction as yesterday morning. At first, it only tests the dust. Fine particles tremble beside the flake, then slide a short distance along the wash floor. A few grains move away from the hoodoo's base and settle in the shallow groove that circles the column. Then another breath of wind lifts them again. The loosened sediment has begun its next journey. It does not travel far all at once. It moves in pauses, in little arcs, in short creeps over the pale floor. One grain strikes the edge of the flake and rebounds towards the wash. Another rolls into the lee of a pebble and stops there. A third disappears into the general brightness, too small to follow. This is how the hoodoo enters the wider basin, not as a single fallen monument, but as grains released into many separate paths. Some will help polish the next wall, some will settle behind a shrub, some will become part of a dust crescent beneath a fallen slab. Some may leave this corridor entirely, carried beyond the Badlands as faint suspended powder. You follow the moving grains away from the pedestal, because the story now belongs to their departure. The wash accepts them without changing its shape in any obvious way. Its floor is already marked by older dust streaks, older ripples, and older patches of coarse lag. The new grains join those older patterns and become indistinguishable almost immediately. This is one of the quiet truths of Bisti. A fresh change can be real, and still vanish into the larger surface by noon. The morning wind strengthens just enough to lift the finest powder from the base. A pale veil slides along the ground, never rising very high. It passes the ribbed slope, where yesterday's flakes still rest in a loose apron. It curls around the fallen capstone that shelters its new patch of clay. It moves past the shrub mound, where roots hold a small island against removal. Each obstacle sorts the grains again. Each turn of the wash decides which particles continue and which ones pause. The flake from the hoodoo remains behind for now. It is too large for the morning breeze, but its edges are already losing powder. Later, rain may wet it. Sun may dry it. Salt may open tiny spaces inside it, A stronger wind may chip its corners with sand carried from elsewhere. Eventually, it too will become smaller pieces, and those pieces will move. Nothing has to happen today for the direction to be clear. The hoodoo's loss has entered a chain of later consequences. You look back once from the washbend. The tilted cap is still visible, its shadow tucked tightly beneath one edge. From this distance, the fresh scatter below it is almost invisible. A visitor crossing the basin now might not notice anything unusual. They might see only a small hoodoo among many, still standing under the morning sky. But because you stayed through evening, night, and dawn, the modest change has become legible. The land has not announced itself. It has simply continued. That is the reward for watching a slow landscape carefully. You learn that evidence can be quiet and still be decisive. A crack can matter before it opens wide. A flake can matter before it becomes dust. A dust ridge can matter before it becomes a visible drift. The basin is rewritten at the scale of patience. The wash widens as it carries the new grains outward. Beyond the corridor, the larger San Juan Basin lies open, pale and dry beneath the growing light. Low mesas hold the horizon, and the Badlands sit among them like exposed pages of an old earth. The fruitland and kirtland layers remain stacked below the surface, offering hardness and softness in uneven measures. Ancient mud, sand, ash, and plant-rich seams continue to decide where modern wind can work. The present breeze is only the latest reader of those layers. It follows the surface, finds loosened grains, clears hollows, polishes bases, and leaves dust where the air slows. The process feels delicate because each action is small. It feels powerful because the actions do not stop. Over many seasons, the tilted hoodoo will answer more mornings like this. Some mornings will leave no visible trace. Some will remove a little dust from the neck. Some will bring moisture first, then drying, then a sharper release. One day the cap may settle farther into its fracture. One day it may fall and begin sheltering a new patch of ground. But that day is not required for the story to have a payoff. The turning point has already happened. The cap no longer rests on the same unbroken support it once had. The column can hold for now, but it cannot return to its earlier balance. The wind moves on from the hoodoo, carrying a portion of its loosened surface into the open wash. Where the corridor bends, the grains spread into a thin fan. Where the fan crosses a firmer sandstone step, some grains bounce and continue. Where it reaches a sheltered hollow, others settle into a soft, pale pocket. By midday, this pocket may be brushed away. By next season, the sandstone step may stand a little more clearly above the clay beside it. By some later century, another cap may protect another column, using material shifted from forms now gone. The basin has no final arrangement. It has only temporary balances, some broad and ancient, some small enough to fit beneath a flake. The morning grows brighter, and the shadows shorten again. Details that were sharp at dawn begin to soften under higher light. The crack beneath the cap becomes harder to see. The dust fan blends into the wash floor. The whole field returns to stillness in the ordinary eye. But the stillness is no longer empty. It contains the night wind, the fresh flake, the faint ridge, the shifted dust, and the long path of grains away from the pedestal. It contains the old coastal plain buried in the clay. It contains the dry air that now edits that ancient record. You leave the hoodoo standing behind you, altered but quiet. Its cap holds the morning sun, its narrow neck holds the cap, its base meets the next low wind. The wash carries the smallest pieces onward, across polished clay and between scattered shrubs, toward other hollows waiting to be swept. And somewhere beyond the bend, where the corridor opens into pale mounds and low sandstone rims, the next carving has already begun.